Hello, Joanne. How are
Hi,
you doing?
how are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good indeed. So I think Armand hopefully is on his way over here now as well, and will be joining us very shortly. And I can see that we do already have a few people lined up to come and join us on stage as well. So, but just whilst we're waiting for Armand, did you have any initial thoughts on the discussions that you've heard so far? Obviously, you've chaired the first session yesterday and the ones that have happened since. Any kind of initial key thinking or takeaways from what we've heard so far?
Well, I have some thoughts about the session. I just listened to the session. So I was surprised there was so much discussion on spectrum sharing, but it in a sense, and maybe I can talk to that. I think the US is different than many other countries in that respect. And I have some questions as well as to sharing with DoD and the experience so far. So.
Perfect. Well, that sounds great. Well, I can see that I'm going to start bringing a couple of people up because I can see, hopefully, I think my colleagues are on it to try and get Armand over here, and so we can get his him to become involved and get up onto the stage here as well. So I see Chantal has just joined us as well. Just a reminder to everybody out there, if you do want to come and bring your audio video feed live, you want to come and have your comments on what you've heard so far, then please do that. You just need to click on the button at the top right, which says, I think it says request to bring audio and video live, and you'll be brought up onto the stage. But in the meantime, I will wait here as well. But Joanne, I'll pass over to yourself. You see we have Chantal up already, and we have others waiting for you. So
I thought no, Armand was going to start, and I was going to chime in, or do you want me to start?
Well, I think we can get going if that's okay. Whilst we're waiting for Armand, then we'll try and bring him up shortly as well. So if that's okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Over to you then.
All right. Oh my goodness. Joanne, Chantal, and Vina. What are my first thoughts while we wait for Armand, the moderator, for the prior session? I think I was surprised, actually, talking about spectrum efficiency, to have the discussion almost entirely focused on spectrum sharing. I think the U.S. is up to now has been different than other countries. I think there's a fair amount of resistance of spectrum sharing, I think, in a lot of other areas. But you know, the U.S. is really pushing for that with spectrum sharing in the CBRS and then the 6 gigahertz and more coming, as we can see with going down below 3.45. So I don't know if we still have the panelists from the prior session, but I know at some point there was a mention that there's been up to now no interference for the incumbents in CBRS. So I think the incumbents are the Navy, and I was wondering if there were instances where the Navy has up to now, produced interference for the CBRS users or WISPs and other providers. So I'm not sure if we have the panelists from the last panel that can answer that, or maybe anyone has some discussion on that. So, and I'm not so sure that all the other countries are so keen on spectrum sharing as the US is. So maybe we can get some feedback on that.
Joanne, it's Jennifer. Maybe just an observation. The FCC just finished their CBRS auction. So on the license, we're not involved. It's just, I know what's going on. But in terms of the licensed spectrum, hasn't been put to use yet. So the only spectrum that's available today is unlicensed.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that for folks, but I don't have an answer to your other question about the interference.
Yeah, we know that only the GA is available now, so the PAL's just completed. But the Navy would, if they do blast with their radar on the coastline, they would blast the GA as well. So I was just wondering if there was any feedback on that. And there was some comment from Andy Clegg that maybe they're protecting the incumbents too well, and I think he meant DoD. So that's the gist of that question. But maybe someone else wants to talk, or Chantal, I'm going to put you on the spot. What about spectrum sharing in Canada? How do you think that would be? I know you've consulted on that. You didn't get a lot of positive responses, I think.
Yeah, so we didn't have the same issue as the FCC did and the NTIA. We don't have those users, so for that portion of the band, we're auctioning it.
Yeah.
That being said, we're really, keen on spectrum sharing, but I think it's a different definition, whether or not you do CBRS or whether or not you do some other type of sharing. So if you look at our millimeter wave spectrum, for example, we are sharing with satellites where we think that there's satellite dependent areas, and then there's a certain percentage of the population that can be encumbered by satellites. So we're doing a combination of that, and just not maybe specifically the dynamic spectrum sharing. That being said, we're also looking at that for other things as well, because we do see there's some areas that might be useful for.
Okay. Oh, Chantal, if I might add, you have also some ATC spectrum sharing, geographic sharing between satellite and terrestrial, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, we do have that as well. So we similar to the US have AWS-4, which is a combination of mobile as well as satellite, and so we have that as well. So I think if you look at the past, we had spectrum sharing before. It was just more very specific. So in a lot of cases in Canada, we do where and when necessary. So if we're not moving somebody out, they stay, and then they're sharing services.
I know, Veena, you wanted to chime in on this, or?
No, I think for me, spectrum sharing, as Chantal said, you really have to explain what you mean by spectrum sharing, because it can be interpreted in so many ways. And right now, when you talk about CBRS, you're talking about very specific government incumbents. And in order to make the access to 5G, to get the spectrum out there, if there was no other choice, then spectrum sharing is great. And working with these databases and the environmental sensing capability, you can do that, and you can do that in the United States. That's great. But some people also think spectrum sharing in terms of, you heard today, for example, third-party providing services to MNOs. And there the spectrum is pooled perhaps for the MNOs. And some folks think that is spectrum sharing, So it just depends what you think in terms of sharing. I would say sharing with getting access to more spectrum is definitely, whichever way we can do that, that is great, because that's more efficient, more intensive use of the spectrum. But we should not mix that kind of sharing with inter-service sharing or the other kinds of sharing we are talking about. It's a very broad title for spectrum sharing.
So, there's one of the interesting things on sort of spectrum sharing or big network sharing is one of the few places.
Thanks.
One of the few places that has been successful has been in Canada, right? Sort of covering rural areas, and I'm actually blanking on the two networks that are sharing. And it's pretty much failed almost everywhere else in the world. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of why it's worked, where it has worked.
Well, I would say, Armand, spectrum sharing that's been done in Canada is really like network sharing, and
Right.
they share.
Well, even further than network spectrum sharing.
Yeah, they lower. It's a way to lower your capex intensity, your capital investment, and that's what has happened. And it's gone to such an extent now that between, for example, Bell and Telus, they don't even call it spectrum share. They call it network access, because one carrier builds one part of the country and the other one builds other parts of the country. And essentially you have two carriers, but they each have half a network across the country, or that's what I would qualify it. So, but it was a way to, really reduce your capital investment. You pool your spectrum resources, so it is pretty, useful from that. You buy spectrum separately in auctions, you pool them via subordinate licenses, and then you each build. So you lower your overall costs, and that's why it's, and they're two incumbents, so maybe they compete, but it's not necessarily applicable in all areas. Whenever you talk about that in the US, they say they're not interested, but up to now anyway.
Well, they've tried it in Alaska and it didn't work very well, right? It just seems that, I don't know if it's a different regulatory environment or a different social way of operating, but that just sticks out as the one place where it's worked and it hasn't elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a question of different competitive rivalry environments, I think. That would be my 2 cents on it. But maybe someone else, Mr. Wolf, you have something you'd like to talk about?
Hi, so I'm Ben. You guys are coming from the perspective of largely service providers, it seems like, as well as the regulators' view related to that. I'm coming from a very different perspective now, although I time in that world working with licensed spectrum. I have been for the last 20 years or so focused mostly on unlicensed uses and innovation in how to get the most out of the spectrum. So for me, the metrics of efficiency, I think, are quite different than what other people apply. I start with the number of, I start with where we see the spectrum is where you have a lot of users. And so competing users who are not coordinated. And so one of the things that I'm looking at a lot these days is the sharing from a different perspective, not CBRS and AFC. These are more centralized control where you assume that sharing is done with a boss, right? There's a coordinating system. And another very important, I think for the future, even more important, is the sharing where there isn't a boss. So where the various systems, users of the spectrum are figuring out how to share effectively. I won't say on their own, but in a cooperative way that is not necessarily coordinated by a central entity. And I think that this is becoming increasingly more important in a lot of applications that we have traditionally kind of made assumptions about, where those assumptions are now changed. And again, one of my big areas right now is looking at how multiple unlicensed technologies will coexist in the same space as well as in the same device even. From the consumer's point of view, there really isn't such a thing as a single radio device anymore. For a lot of the systems you guys are talking about, we're talking about we have, we may have a single radio or single radio technology for a given link, but as was mentioned in the last one, in the real world, a network is comprised of many, many different technologies, and having them work together is key. I think on a scale, that's obviously very true. I think it's becoming more and more necessary to look at that on the small scale. And so that's kind of where we come from, is looking at innovation on the micro scale and then growing it to the macro scale, if you will.
Joanne, can I add to the discussion? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
So coming from the satellite, and Ben, that was very interesting. Coming from the satellite perspective, I guess look at it kind of differently. For years, our industry has shared both between satellite operators, as you know, and with other services, most notably very successfully with the fixed service. What we're seeing now, though, with sharing, and as an American, I can speak back from the U.S. perspective, is sharing doesn't mean sharing. It means boxing one user, usually satellite, which is my interest, of course, into a very small geographic area, and giving greater flexibility to the other operator. So just to give an example, in the FCC Spectrum Frontiers proceeding in the millimeter wave bands, those are bands that are very important to us for individually licensed earth stations, things for like gateways. The ban was made that we could share, but only in the most rural and remote portions of the country where we probably can't get fiber and personnel to it. We can't be near highways, we can't be near roads. So my big concern on this discussion of 5G was, during the discussion, I think it became accepted, and it is accepted, satellite and other technologies, whether it's unlicensed or fiber or drones or whatever, are going to be part of the 5G ecosystem. And the concern I have about the discussions on sharing is it's all really focused on primarily on making terrestrial mobile have access to additional spectrum. And that's the concern, which is not that we should have exact equal. I would never tell you that, but there needs to be a balance, whatever that balance is. And unfortunately, the sharing discussions that I've heard today don't take that into account. So it's a concern because you aren't going to be able to solve issues like the digital divide unless you have a lot of money with things like fiber and terrestrial mobile. You're going to need access to non-terrestrial technologies such as satellites. So just a different thought there on the sharing side.
So maybe I could weigh in from a regulatory perspective. We don't look at it as one service. Like if you look at our Spectrum Outlook, we were looking at 4 different services: license exempt, looking at satellite, backhaul, and 5G. We weren't considering only one way of making connectivity happen. And I think that's, and you heard that from Ira, and you've heard it from the FCC earlier. There's not just one way of making it happen. We need all the pieces to be in play. And for us, we recognize that license exempt is equally as important as 5G, as well as satellite. We need all those things to cover our country, especially our country being so big. And when we want to have people with connectivity in their home as well as outside. So we have to look at it as a whole bunch of different pieces that eventually will work together. And unfortunately, sometimes they're competing. So we have to look at what the best mix is overall.
Joanne?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I make a comment on a broader issue which we are talking for this session about the shape of the future of digital connectivity? And basically, if we really want to look at that digital connectivity, we need to connect everyone. Jennifer says we need to, have the satellites, and Chantal said yes, we will have, different technologies to serve the purpose, and I share that. But at the end of the day, it will come down to what can meet the requirements of a given community or area or geographic thing. So I have to say that maybe let me backtrack. The sessions we had this morning were excellent. It was very, very good discussion, and I congratulate Forum Global for that. We heard a lot of things. We heard get the spectrum to the marketplace as early as possible. And one size doesn't fit all, different spectrums have different benefits, etc. Very, very good comments. 2 comments which I think, one, I did not hear was in the context of getting this digital connected society for everyone was the importance of harmonization. And the second comment which I heard, and we have this, I have so many friends in the satellite industry, and Jennifer would agree with that, but she being one of them. So, but you hear the comment that 5G doesn't need any more spectrum. 5G has a lot of spectrum. I think that requires a lot of debate in terms of whether what satellite industry needs, what 5G needs, what unlicensed needs, and we need to look at that. But there's one thing clear, that to get the digitally connected society for all, 5G needs spectrum, which will provide the coverage and the capacity. So when we keep talking about 5G, looking for spectrum below 1 gig, below 6 gig, and millimeter waves, we need that spectrum below 1 gig for that coverage. We need that spectrum in the mid-band to provide coverage and capacity. And of course, we heard this quote unquote 17 gigahertz, which came out of WRC 19, which everyone has done their sums. And yes, it is 17 gigahertz. But I think we need to then bring it from an international to the national level of that millimeter wave spectrum and see how much, Canada would be able to assign. US already only auctioned, for example, in the 40 gig. There is 6.5 gigs of spectrum from an international perspective. US only auctioned 2.4, but 2.4 gig in 40 gig range. So coming back to my coverage and capacity issue, I just want to note, and the harmonization issue, that WRC 23 is going to provide an excellent opportunity to harmonize the band we need definitely for coverage, because the coverage at 3.5 gig is not the same as what we get at 700. And the WRC23 will also provide an excellent opportunity to harmonize the bands for the 3.3 to 3.8 gig, referred to as C band, and possibly have some more mid-band spectrum. The reason I say that is right now the coverage band is 700 meg. Yes, we can talk about refarming of the other bands. It's cost, timing, everything. So the new bands for 5G are only we have at this point in time. If you want to introduce services from a coverage perspective in the next couple of years, that's what you have, 700. What you have is parts of C band for coverage and capacity. But to say that 5G won't need more spectrum, my question would be, well, what happens when the 700 is, with limited spectrum in 700, is exhausted? Where do we go? And that's why WRC23 would look at 600 meg, would look at harmonizing the C band, and then adding possibly in the mid-band range the additional spectrum in 6 gig. And I think we should look at that harmonization opportunity. We should not miss it, because 600 meg has been on the agenda since WRC 2015. And I hate to say to my colleagues here that C-band, at least I have been following since 2007. The WRC 2007, we started the discussion on C-band. We're going to WRC 2023, and it's about time that we get the mid-band spectrum sorted out for 5G. 5G is here, it's going to happen, and let's make sure that we provide not only what is there now, but a good evolution of the spectrum. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Arman.
Can I just push back slightly and maybe agree with Jennifer, which I don't always do. But it seems that these companies who go and spend millions of dollars lobbying the FCC or go into the ITU don't do that because of some idealistic idea that they want to close the digital divide. They do that because they want to make as much money as possible. And for a big incumbent, one of the ways to make as much money as possible is to have rules that squeeze out potential new entrants that can compete with them. And I think there's a concern that may be happening, that the industry may be trying to squeeze out new entrants such as satellite operators who are becoming increasingly competitive in other technologies that may make the industry such that they'll make less money, right? And that it's that's being camouflaged as a need for more spectrum. I think that's what you're saying.
Arman, I'm very sensitive to what you just said. Of course, I'm on a very personal level. I'm one of those people that's at the end of a DSL line in a rural area with zero options beyond what the 2.5 bits that can be provided that way. So the question that you just raised implicitly, which is how do you encourage investment in underserved markets when the reason that investment isn't happening already is because the markets are so small? And how does competition really help if the market's so small? If there's dozens of potential users you can compete for versus millions of users, which is it's obvious which is more attractive. So I'm curious how people feel, and I think I also would ask people to start evaluating what are the assumptions that we've been operating under for all of these years. In my own experience, innovation often comes from challenging assumptions and recognizing where your assumptions are wrong. I can point at semiconductor technology, I can point at radio technology, where our gentleman's understanding of the laws of physics have been proven to be incomplete, and we've expanded a capability by revisiting those assumptions. Are there market assumptions that are there non-technical assumptions that are limiting how we address these problems?
Maybe I could say something. In Canada, it's a huge problem, obviously, with lots of areas that are very low population, and it's a mixture of solutions. And that's the way we have to look at it, and that's the way we do as a regulator. We need spectrum, we need infrastructure, and there has to be money at the end of the day, because there isn't some of those places just aren't going to get reached without some money. So one of the things that we do, similar to the US, is we have broadband funds, and that's the way to, in some of those areas, to get anybody to go in, because it's just not it's just not a big business case for anybody to serve 100 people in an area that requires a lot of money with respect to satellite or fiber to get there, and that you can only get there part of the year. Right? So those are the things that we do, is to find that mixture.
Guys, I'm sorry to have to jump in. We're coming to the end of the time, though. So, I mean, does anyone have any final comments or final thoughts they wanted to give before we wrap up?
Can I make one comment? Sorry.
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Armand, you brought the cost into picture, and I should have brought the cost into picture too. And I would say, in order to provide the service, it's not just digital divide. You need to compare the cost, and you know very well, cost of a C-band base station and how many number of base stations we would need to cover the same area, versus whether a 28 gigahertz base station even could cover the same area because of the propagation considerations. So that's why I say that you need, bands like mid-band spectrum is extremely important, not just to deal with the digital divide, but make sure we have a cost-effective infrastructure also for the operators. Thank you.
Thank you, Veena. Anybody else want any final remarks?
Dan, I just can't resist, because I go back to my concern about adoption. And that is, and I understand what Ben says, our industry provides a lot of service in rural areas, but there's a lot of people who still aren't adopting. And I really do think it's important, and whether it's the regulator or ministries and companies need to really work together. I think the pandemic really, for the first time, brought a lot of people on board to the importance of access to broadband. And without the adoption, without users, you're never going to have the business case to bring service to everyone. So I know spectrum is, I spend my life with spectrum. It's a huge part, but I think adoption has to be part of that. And, as we talked about earlier, there are some places, some people who just don't want to adopt, and, that impacts what's possible. So just a thought on closing the digital divide, which I agree with Armand, it's economic, but I think it's also a focus. Companies do actually do things sometimes because there's actually a good coming out of it too. So sorry.
Thank you, Jennifer. And
well, good,
look, guys, thank you all so much.
You aren't necessarily.
This definitely is a discussion that we could continue for a lot longer, but I think we are out of time. One thing I just wanted to mention, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for your involvement in this, and just wanted to mention how nice it is to have the women on the panel outnumbering the men. So it's something that we do try and with gender balance, but it's great for the women to be outnumbering the men on this. So thank you all so much for that. But
Thanks,
a great
Dan.
discussion there, and really enjoyed all of the discussions today. So I think we've had some fantastic panels and discussions throughout the day today. One of the key areas, obviously, that was brought up in quite a bit of detail there was the digital divide. And that brings us quite nicely onto some of the sessions for tomorrow. So tomorrow we start very slightly later than today. We start at 9:10, so 10 minutes later, and that's, of course, Washington, D.C. time. And the focus for tomorrow is on innovating to connect citizens and businesses everywhere. The first session we're going to have is going to be focusing specifically on rural connectivity. So I'm sure some of the issues that have been raised today will be continued in that session there. And then we're moving on to another session, which Jennifer, I'm sure you'll be very interested in, which is looking at innovation specifically in the satellite and aerospace sectors. So again, issues that have been raised throughout today, and it'll be a session which is focusing specifically on that side of things. We also have another round of showcases and another opportunity for you all to come live in the same way as you have done here in the Have Your Say session here. So
we're doing a showcase.
Showcase. Go on, Joanne. What's your showcase is? Go on.
On CBRS and the value of a shared spectrum. So
perfect. There we are. Well, there's a reason to come back tomorrow for Joanne's showcase there. So fantastic. Guys, thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone out there as well. Thanks for everyone who's tuned in and who's contributed with your comments and thoughts as well. As I said, back here tomorrow at 9:10. But for everyone, enjoy the rest of the day today. Have a good evening, and looking forward to seeing everyone back here tomorrow. So thank you again, everyone. And
thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for struggling through and making this happen this year.
Thank you, Dan.
thanks, Alan. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you much.